Take your dog and get out. My son pointed at the front door as rain pounded against the windows. His wife held their baby and sneered, "You've been a burden long enough." Then my son dragged my old dog across the hardwood floor and shoved him out into the storm. I quietly picked up my suitcase clipped on the leash and walked away without a word. 48 hours later, a silver-haired lawyer placed a document in front of me. When my son saw the final page, he stumbled backward and whispered, "No, this can't be happening." Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at your heart, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, what city, what country. I read every single one, and knowing you're out there means more than you know. A small note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to names or places is purely coincidental, but every lesson in it is worth carrying with you. I have lived through hard winters in Harlan County. I have buried my wife with my own 2 hands. I have worked through fevers and back pain and years when money was so tight I counted quarters for groceries. But nothing, not one single thing in 72 years of living, hit me the way those 5 words did. Take your dog and get out. That was my son's voice. My Daniel. The boy I had rocked through ear infections at 2 in the morning. The boy I had driven 400 miles to college with his whole life packed in the back of my truck. That same voice, hard as winter asphalt, telling me to get out of the house I helped pay for. Let me take you back to that night. October. Nashville. The kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as it attacks sideways, cold, the kind that soaks through a jacket before you even have time to pull up the collar. I had been sitting in my small room on the 2nd floor reading an old Louis L'Amour paperback with Max curled up at the foot of the bed. Max is my golden retriever, 10 years old. Gray around the muzzle, moves a little slower than he used to, but still follows me everywhere like I'm the only solid thing in the world. That night he got restless, started pawing at the door. I figured he needed to go out to the yard, so I let him. I should have gone with him. About 10 minutes later, I heard Vanessa's voice slice through the floor below me. High sharp, the kind of pitch that doesn't need volume to cut deep. "Oh my God, Daniel, get in here right now." I was already halfway down the stairs before she screamed his name a 2nd time. I came around the corner into the living room and found Max standing at the edge of the rug, muddy paws on the hardwood tail, tucked low ears flat against his head. He'd come in through the back door I hadn't latched properly. The yard was soaked. His paws were a mess. That was it. That was the whole crime. Vanessa was standing near the couch, pressing baby Liam against her chest like Max had come in breathing fire. Liam was 8 months old, healthy and completely unbothered. His little face turned sideways against his mother's shoulder. "That animal almost jumped on my baby," she said, her voice cracking at the edges. "Vanessa, he's standing by the door," I said, keeping my voice even. "He didn't go anywhere near Liam. Don't tell me what he did or didn't do. I saw it." Her eyes were blazing, jaw set hard. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Every single day, there's something with that dog. Hair on the couch, muddy floors, and now this." I bent down and started wiping Max's paws, with my hand gentle, the way I always did. Max licked my wrist once, still trembling a little from the rain. "I'll clean it up," I said. "Give me 5 minutes." That's when Daniel came down the hallway. He was still in his work clothes, slacks collar button, undone a glass of something in his hand. He looked at the floor, looked at Max, looked at Vanessa. Something passed between them. I didn't catch it in the air so much as feel it land in my chest. Vanessa leaned toward him and lowered her voice, but not enough. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "I mean it, Daniel. I cannot keep doing this." Daniel set his glass down on the entry table. He didn't look at me yet. He rubbed the back of his neck jaw, working like he was chewing on something he needed to swallow, before he said it. "Dad." His voice was flat, not angry. Flat is worse than angry, I've come to know. Anger at least means someone still cares enough to feel something. I think it's time we talked about the arrangement. The arrangement, I repeated. This isn't working. He finally looked at me. His eyes were tired red around the rims. Vanessa and I have a new baby. We need our space. We need our house to feel like our house. My hand stilled on Max's paws. I thought this was supposed to be my home too, son. Vanessa made a sound in the back of her throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff, something worse than both. Daniel. Her voice had that particular kind of quiet that means the decision has already been made, and this conversation is just paperwork. Do what you said you were going to do. He walked to the hall closet. I heard hangers shifting. He came back carrying my old blue suitcase, the one I'd packed with everything I brought from Harlan, and set it down by the front door. Not threw it. Set it. Like it was something he'd been practicing. Dad, take your dog and get out. He looked at the floor when he said it. I can't live with a stubborn old man and a dirty animal anymore. The room went cold around those words. I stood up slowly. My knees made that crackling sound they always do in damp weather. I looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for the boy who used to fall asleep in my truck on long drives home, head against the window, breath fogging the glass. I couldn't find him anywhere in that face. Vanessa had already turned away, adjusting Liam's blanket, as if the conversation was over, and had been over for some time. I walked to the suitcase. My hands did not shake. I want you to know that. 72 years old, standing in the rain smell of a house I helped buy, and my hands did not shake. I picked up Max's leash from the hook by the door. Come on, buddy, I said quietly. Max walked to me. He pressed his whole body against my leg, warm and solid, and for one moment I was more grateful for that dog than I have words for. I opened the front door. Rain hit us both immediately, cold and total, soaking through my flannel shirt in seconds. I picked up my suitcase with one hand and held Max's leash with the other, and I stepped off the porch of that house without looking back. The door closed behind me. No slam, just the soft final click of a latch catching. I stood on the front walk in the dark, and the rain, 72 years old, holding a suitcase and a leash with maybe $40 in my shirt pocket, and a phone with 11% battery. Max pressed against my leg and looked up at me, rain matting down his gold fur tail, still waiting. I know, boy, I said. I know. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how the night would end. What I did know, standing there in the Nashville dark, was this: the real story didn't start that night. It started a long, long time before. And if you want to understand how a father ends up standing in the rain outside his own son's house, you have to go back to the beginning. To understand why that night broke me the way it did, you have to understand where I came from. Not Nashville. Not the wide streets and the bright lights and the neighborhoods where every house looks like it was built to impress someone. I'm talking about Harlan County, Kentucky. Back roads and ridgelines and the smell of wood smoke in October. A place where a man was measured by what he could build, not what he could buy. I grew up the son of a coal miner. My father went underground 6 days a week and came home gray with dust, and when the mines started closing in the early 80s, half the county went with them. Men who had spent their whole lives underground suddenly had nothing to do with their hands. Some of them drank. Some of them just sat on their porches and watched the hills like the hills owed them something. I picked up a chisel instead. I was 28 years old when I built my first real piece, a rocking chair from a red oak I'd felled myself on our back property. Margaret watched me sand it down on the porch one Saturday afternoon, little Daniel on her hip, maybe 18 months old, and already trying to grab everything within reach. George Miller, she said, leaning against the doorframe. You talk to that wood like it can hear you. Maybe it can, I said. I ran my thumb along the grain, feeling for any rough spot I'd missed. Wood's honest. You put in the work, it shows. You cut corners, it shows too. She laughed, that soft laugh she had that started in her chest and worked its way up. You know, you just described yourself right. I looked up at her. Afternoon light was coming sideways through the pines, catching the dust motes floating up from the chair. Margaret had that look on her face she got sometimes fond and a little sad at the same time, like she could already see years ahead that I couldn't. You're going to be all right, old man, she said quietly. And so is this family. I believed her. Back then I believed everything Margaret told me. Those were tight years. Lord, they were tight. The kind of tight where you learn to fix your own truck engine at midnight because a mechanic is not in the budget. The kind of tight where Margaret stretched a pot of chicken soup 3 days running and never once made you feel like you were eating leftovers. Daniel grew up on that soup on that little house that smelled like sawdust and pine resin, and Margaret's coffee going on the stove before sunup. But Margaret's lungs were never right. It started as a cough in winter that wouldn't quit. Then it was every season. The doctor over in Middlesbrough used words I had to look up at the library: chronic inflammatory progressive. He said the damp air in old houses didn't help. He said she needed medication we couldn't always afford. I started taking every job that came through: kitchen cabinets, barn doors, church pews, fence posts. I worked with a flashlight in the winter, when the days got too short, finishing orders on the workbench behind the house, breath coming out in clouds in the cold. Daniel used to sneak out there and sit on a stool in the corner watching me work. "Dad, why do you always smell the wood first?" he asked me one night. He couldn't have been more than 7. Pajamas with little trucks on them, socks with holes in the toes. "Because every piece is different," I told him. "Oak smells like rain. Pine smells like Christmas. Cherry smells almost sweet, like something good is coming." I handed him a scrap of cherry wood. "Here, tell me what you smell." He pressed it to his nose and screwed up his face in concentration, the way only kids can. "Like Grandma's kitchen." I laughed so hard I had to put down my chisel. "Yeah, son, just like that." Those were the moments I held on to through the hard years. Not the bills, not the winters when the heat cut out. Those moments in the workshop, my boy on his stool, learning to love what his hands could do. When his teachers started calling him gifted, I didn't know what to do with the word at first. Then his high school principal, a straight-talking woman named Mrs. Dawson, sat me down in her office and told me flat out, "Mr. Miller, your son has a mind that does not belong in a coal county with no industry. He needs a university." I drove home that afternoon and sat in the workshop for a long time, running my hand over an unfinished tabletop, thinking. Margaret found me there after supper. She sat down on the old stool Daniel always used and folded her hands in her lap. "You already know what you're going to do," she said. "It's a lot of money, Maggie. It's his life, George." And that was that. I worked double shifts from Daniel's sophomore year through his senior year. Margaret stretched every dollar I brought in like it was taffy. We didn't take a vacation. We didn't buy new furniture. We drove the same truck until the floorboards rusted through and I welded a patch on myself. The morning I drove Daniel to the University of Kentucky, I helped him carry 2 bags and a box of books up to his dormitory room. His roommate was already there, music playing from a little speaker on the desk. Daniel looked around at everything: the cinder block walls, the thin mattress, the window looking out over the quad, and his face did something I will never forget. It opened up, like a window thrown wide on the first warm morning after a long winter. "Dad," he said, turning to me, eyes bright, "I'm actually going to do this." "I know you are," I said. I hugged him once firm, the way Miller men hug quick, but meaning every second of it. Then I picked up my keys and walked back to the truck alone. I didn't go back inside to watch him settle in. I stood by the truck in the parking lot for a while, looking up at the building, finding his window. I could just make out his silhouette moving around inside, already starting to become someone new. Pastor Jim Caldwell, my oldest friend back in Harlan, had told me once, "George, the hardest part of loving someone right is knowing when to let them walk away from you. Standing in that parking lot, I finally understood what he meant. I got in the truck. I drove the 4 hours back to Harlan alone. The seat beside me was empty the whole way, and the cab smelled like the cedar wood I'd lined it with years ago. I turned on the radio to a country station and let the miles roll under me. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought the empty seat meant I had done my job. I planted a tree. I watered it. I watched it grow tall and strong and reach for a sky I could barely see from where I stood. And I told myself that was enough for any man. I did not understand, not yet, that some trees grow so tall they forget the ground they came from. The rain had soaked through my flannel shirt down to the skin. My back ached the way it always does in cold weather, that deep grinding ache that starts at the base of the spine and works its way up like a slow fire. Max was pressed against my left leg, shivering, his wet fur cold under my hand. I kept stroking him anyway, more for myself than for him, if I'm honest. I had maybe $40 in my shirt pocket and 11% battery on a phone I didn't know who to call. That's when I started thinking about Howard Bennett. Funny how the mind works when everything else falls away. 30 years gone, and that man's face came back to me as clear as the day I first saw him pull up to my workshop in a truck that was held together by rust and stubbornness. It was 1995. Howard Bennett was 35 years old, running a small furniture company out of a rented warehouse space off Old Hickory Boulevard in Nashville. He'd driven 2 hours to find me after somebody at a trade show mentioned my name. His company was hemorrhaging money, one bad contract, one bad season, and he was staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. He walked into my workshop, looked around at the pieces I had going, ran his hand along an unfinished oak sideboard I'd been working on for a week, and said the thing that made me trust him immediately. "You don't make furniture," he said. "You make things that outlast people." "Most things do," I told him. "People aren't built as well as they used to be." He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and we shook hands right there in the sawdust. I spent 3 weeks on that commission. A full dining set table, 6 chairs, a sideboard, all in quarter-sawn white oak with hand-cut dovetail joints on every drawer. Margaret thought I had lost my mind, working until 1 and 2 in the morning, knuckles, raw eyes burning. "George, you're going to work yourself into a hospital bed," she told me one night, standing in the workshop door in her robe, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "I'll sleep when it's done," I said. "You always say that." She handed me the coffee and sat down on Daniel's stool. "Is this one special?" I thought about it. "This man needs it to be special, Maggie. His whole company is riding on what I put into this wood." She watched me work for a while, sipping her coffee. Then she said, "Then you better make it the best thing you've ever built." I did. Howard took that set to a regional design showcase in Atlanta. He called me from a payphone the next morning. This was before everyone had a cell phone glued to their hand, and I could hear him trying to keep his voice steady. "George," he said, "I just signed a contract worth more than my entire last year's revenue. Because of that dining set. Because of you." My chest felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with pride. It was something quieter. Satisfaction. The kind that comes from doing a thing right all the way through. "Don't thank me," I told him. "Thank the oak." He laughed again. "I'm thanking you, you stubborn old man." After that, Howard and I worked together for years. He sold, I built. We never had a formal contract past the first one, just a handshake and a phone call when he needed something new. I never asked what he did with the pieces. I just made them and let them go. Now, sitting in the rain on my son's front steps 30 years later, that handshake felt like the last solid thing I had to hold on to. I pulled my phone out. The screen was cracked at one corner, rain-spotted, barely bright enough to read. I scrolled to Howard's name in my contacts. My thumb hovered over it. "Think he still remembers us, buddy?" I asked Max. Max turned his head and licked the rainwater off my wrist. I almost pressed call. Almost. My thumb was right there, trembling with cold more than hesitation, when headlights swept across the front of the house. A dark sedan rolled slowly to the curb. The engine cut. For a moment, there was just the rain and the hiss of wet tires on asphalt, and the distant sound of Nashville traffic somewhere beyond the tree line. The driver's door opened. My heart did something strange in my chest, not pain, not hope exactly, but that feeling you get right before something changes, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. I squinted through the rain, not trusting my old eyes in the dark, trying to make out the figure standing by the car. And then the man stepped under the reach of the porch light, and I felt the breath go right out of me. Silver hair, broad shoulders still carrying themselves straight despite 65 years of living. A brown leather jacket beaded with rain. And that face older than I remembered, carved deeper by time, but the eyes were the same. Still steady. Still the eyes of a man who paid his debts. "Howard," I said. My voice came out rough and low, scraped thin by the cold and by everything else. He looked at me sitting there on those wet steps, soaking wet old dog, pressed against my side suitcase beside my feet. And he didn't flinch. He didn't offer me pity. He just said the thing a man says when words are not enough, and he knows it. "Come on, George, you and Max both." Howard Bennett had never been a man of many words. He never had been. That was one of the things I had always respected about him. He picked up my suitcase before I could reach for it. Just bent down, grabbed the handle, and walked back toward his car like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he'd driven over here specifically for this reason, and had no intention of explaining himself until he was good and ready. "Howard," I said, pushing myself up off the steps. My knees screamed at me and I bit down on the sound. "You don't have to, George." He said my name the way a man stops a conversation, not rude, final. "Get in the car." Max was already trotting toward the passenger side like he'd been waiting for a ride all night. Animals always know. I've said that my whole life, and I'll say it until I'm in the ground. I got in. The heater was already running. Warm air hit my face and my soaking shirt, and I felt my whole body sag with something between relief and humiliation. I was 72 years old, sitting in another man's car, dripping rainwater onto his leather seat, because my own son had put my suitcase by the front door. "Ruth called me," Howard said, pulling away from the curb. His eyes stayed on the road. She saw what happened from across the street. She was visiting her niece 2 houses down. I turned to look at him. Ruth Coleman, my neighbor of 30 years back in Harlan, the woman who had brought casseroles to my house every week after Margaret passed, who had signed her name on a piece of paper for me without asking a single question. Of course, Ruth had been watching. Of course she had. "She had no business calling you at this hour," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped raw by everything I was still trying not to feel. "She had every business," Howard said. "And you know it." I looked out the window. Nashville slid past in streaks of light and rain. Gas stations. Late-night diners with neon signs bleeding color onto the wet street. A city that never fully slept, going on about its business, like nothing had happened, like a 72-year-old man hadn't just been told he was no longer welcome under his own son's roof. Max put his chin on my arm from the back seat. I reached back and put my hand on his head without turning around. Howard's house in the Green Hills neighborhood was a modest 2-story, older than most of its neighbors, and better built than all of them. He'd had the woodwork on the front porch done by a craftsman. He trusted me actually 15 years ago. I recognized the grain pattern on the porch columns the second the headlights hit them. The room he showed me to was on the 2nd floor. Small, clean, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, and a water bowl already on the floor for Max. I looked at that water bowl and felt something crack open behind my sternum. "You were expecting us," I said. Ruth called ahead. Howard set my suitcase down beside the dresser. "Bathroom's down the hall. There's an extra toothbrush in the cabinet." He turned to go, then stopped in the doorway and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded envelope and held it out to me. I was going to find the right time to give you this. Turns out the right time is tonight. I took it. The paper was heavy goods stock, the kind lawyers and accountants use. I unfolded it and looked at the heading, Deferred Compensation Summary, George Miller. Bennett Fine Woodworks. My eyes went to the bottom of the page, to the number. The room tilted a little. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs decided they were done standing. Howard. My voice had gone somewhere very small. What is this? He sat down in the chair by the window, elbows on his knees, looking at me straight the way he always had. Every piece you designed for me over 30 years, George Verse paid you what we agreed. But the royalties from the collections that kept selling the pieces that went into showrooms and hotels and private estates, I kept a separate accounting. Because I knew you'd never ask. My throat tightened like a fist was closing around it. You should have told me. I tried twice, he said. 2014. You told me you didn't need any more than we'd agreed on. 2019. You said the same thing. He leaned back. So I kept it. And I kept adding to it. Because it was yours, George. Every cent of it was yours. I was just holding it until you needed it. My hands were shaking now. Not from cold. The paper rattled between my fingers, and I pressed it flat against my knee to make it stop. 15 years, I said. 15 years. I looked at the number again. Looked away. Looked back. The kind of money that meant I was not had never been the broken-down old man my son's house had made me feel like tonight. Why? My voice cracked on that single word, and I didn't try to fix it. Howard, why would you do this for me? He was quiet for a moment, but not the empty kind of quiet. The thinking kind. Then he said, You know what you did for me in 1995, George? You didn't just make a dining set. You worked yourself half to death for a stranger's dream. You put everything you had into something that wasn't yours. And because of that, my company survived. My family ate. My kids went to college. He looked at me with those steady eyes. You never let me pay that back. So I paid it forward. Into that account. Every year. Whether you liked it or not. I set my mug down on the counter and stood there, with both hands flat on the cold tile, staring at nothing, breathing through it. The way you breathe through pain when making a sound would cost you too much. George. Howard's voice was gentle now, the edge gone out of it. You spent your whole life making things for other people. You made your son's future with your own 2 hands. Tonight you're going to sleep in a warm room, and tomorrow we're going to figure out the rest. All right. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice with actual words just then. Howard stood up and moved to the door. Max had already curled up on the rug at the foot of the bed, chin on his paws, watching us both. One more thing, Howard said from the doorway. He had that look people get when they've been waiting to say something for a long time. That money is enough to live on, George, for a long time. Which means whatever happens next with Daniel, with the house, with any of it, you are not doing it from a place of desperation. You understand me? I raised my eyes to his. My chest ached with something that was grief and gratitude all tangled together, impossible to separate. I understand you, I said. He nodded once, turned off the light, left me alone with Max and the sound of rain on the roof and a piece of paper that was changing everything I thought I knew about where I stood in this world. I sat there in the dark for a long time, that document on my knee, thinking about $47,000 I had handed to my son in a plain envelope. Thinking about a piece of paper Daniel had signed without reading. Thinking about a house in Belle Meade that had my money buried in its foundation like a secret. Something was waking up inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something older and quieter than anger. Clarity. I woke up the next morning in Howard's guest room with Max's chin resting on the edge of the mattress, his brown eyes watching me like he'd been on guard duty all night. Gray light was seeping through the curtains. Somewhere downstairs, coffee was brewing, and the first thing that came into my mind, before the ache in my back, before the memory of that front door closing, was a morning 6 months ago, standing on a hill in Harlan County, with the deed to my land in my hand. Let me take you back there. April 2025. The dogwoods were blooming along the ridge, white flowers against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. That little piece of land had been in my family for 2 generations, 3 acres of hardwood forest, a creek running along the eastern edge, and the stump of a red oak my grandfather had felled before I was born. I used to sit on that stump and think. I had done some of the best thinking of my life on that stump. Ruth Coleman found me there the morning of the sale, same as she always seemed to find me when something important was happening. Ruth had been my neighbor for 30 years, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut close to her head, and the kind of straight-backed walk that told you she had never once let the world push her around without pushing back. She climbed the hill in her good walking shoes and stood beside me looking out over the tree line. "You sure about this, George?" she asked. I ran my thumb along the edge of the deed. The paper was warm from sitting in my shirt pocket all morning. "Daniel needs the money, Ruth. He can't make the down payment on his own." "I know what Daniel needs," she said, in that careful voice she used when she disagreed with something, but had decided not to fight it head on. "I'm asking if you're sure." I looked out at the creek, catching morning light between the trees. Margaret and I had walked that creek every Sunday for 22 years. After she passed, I walked it alone. Max used to splash in the shallow end while I stood on the bank talking to her like she could still hear me. Maybe she could. I've never fully made up my mind about that. She'd want him to have it, I said. Margaret always said everything we built was for him. Ruth didn't answer right away. She just stood there with me, both of us looking at that land like we were saying goodbye to a person. Then my phone rang. "Daniel," I answered on the second ring. "Son." "Dad, hey." His voice was quick, clipped, the voice he used when he was at his desk at work. "Just checking in. Everything on track for this morning." Something small and cold moved through my chest at the word "on track." Like this was a business transaction. Like I was a supplier hitting a deadline. "I'm signing the papers at 10, I said. "Just taking a few minutes up on the hill first." Right. I heard him tap something on his desk. "And you'll wire it directly, yeah, to the account I texted you. I'll wire it today." "Perfect." A pause. "Hey, Dad, this means a lot to us, really." "I know it does, son." After I hung up, Ruth looked at me sideways. I could feel her looking. I kept my eyes on the creek. "He didn't ask how you were," she said. "He's busy." "George, he's busy, Ruth." She let it go. That was the thing about Ruth. She knew when to push and when to step back and let a man be a fool in peace. At the notary's office in town, the closing took about 45 minutes. I signed where they told me to sign. I handed over the deed. $47,000 transferred into the account Daniel had given me. Just like that, 2 generations of land became a line item in somebody else's mortgage application. Before I left, I stopped at the small folding table by the window and asked the notary for a piece of plain paper and a pen. He gave me both without asking why. I wrote it out by hand. Simple and clear, the way I'd always kept my workshop records. The date, my name, Daniel's name. The amount $47,000. The purpose: down payment assistance for the property at Belle Meade, Nashville, Tennessee. And at the bottom, one line that I added because my father had taught me that a man always writes down what he means, to be repaid upon request. I slid it across the table to Daniel when he came in to countersign the wire confirmation. He picked it up, glanced at it, and smiled the way you smile at a child who draws you a picture. "Dad, this isn't necessary," he said. "Humor an old man," I told him. He signed it. Quick. Didn't read past the first 2 lines. Ruth had followed me to the notary's office in her own car. I didn't ask her to, she just showed up the way she always did. When Daniel signed the paper and handed it back to me, Ruth quietly picked up the pen and signed her name at the bottom under Daniel's in the witness line I had left blank. Daniel looked at her. She looked back at him with those clear gray eyes of hers and said, "Seemed like the right thing to do." He laughed it off. I folded the paper and put it back in my shirt pocket right against my chest. That afternoon, I drove back out to the hill one last time. The land already had the quality of something that belonged to someone else, not because anything had changed, but because my connection to it had been cut, and I could feel the difference. I sat on my grandfather's stump for a long time. The creek ran. A woodpecker worked at something in the tree line. Max lay beside the stump with his head in my lap, and I put my hand on his back and felt his breathing slow and steady. "Well, Maggie," I said to the air and the dogwoods and whatever might be listening, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." The wind moved through the oak leaves above me, and I took that for an answer because it was all I had. I drove away and didn't look back. I told myself it was because looking back made leaving harder. The truth is, I was afraid that if I looked back, I would turn the truck around. And Daniel needed that money. My son needed that money. That was the only thing I let myself think about for the whole 4-hour drive north to Nashville. Nashville in May is beautiful in a way that makes you trust it too easily. The trees along the boulevard were full and green. The neighborhoods in Belle Meade had that quiet, moneyed hush to them. And Daniel's house, our house, I told myself back then, had a front porch with 2 rocking chairs and a yard that needed work. I got to work on that yard the first week. I fixed the loose board on the porch steps. I rehung the gate on the side fence that had been dragging against the concrete. I planted tomatoes along the south-facing wall because I'd grown tomatoes every summer since I was 30, and I saw no reason to stop. Daniel came out one morning, coffee in hand, and looked at the garden bed I'd turned over by hand. "Dad, you didn't have to do all this," he said, and he meant it warmly, the way people mean things when everything is still going well. "Felt good to use my hands," I told him. "You know I go crazy without a project." He laughed at that, clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, there's plenty around here if you're looking." Those early weeks had a rhythm I liked. I was up before anyone else made the first pot of coffee, took Max for a walk around the neighborhood while the streets were still quiet. Vanessa was home on maternity leave. Liam had just turned 3 months old, and she was focused on him the way a new mother has every right to be. We weren't close, but we were civil. She thanked me when I cooked dinner. I stayed out of her way when the baby was sleeping. Max was careful around the house. He was a good dog, always had been. He didn't jump on furniture, he wasn't invited onto, didn't beg at the table, didn't bark unless there was a genuine reason. But Vanessa watched him the way some people watch things they've already decided they don't like. Not afraid of him. Just waiting for him to do something she could point to. By June, the waiting was over. "George, I've been reading about pet dander and newborns," she told me one evening while I was washing dishes. Her voice had that particular careful quality of someone who had rehearsed the conversation. "The research shows it can be a real issue for babies under 6 months. I'd feel a lot better if Max stayed in your room." "He's never been near the baby," I said, keeping my voice even. "I know, I'm just saying for Liam's sake." She gave me a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You understand." I did understand. I just didn't say what I understood. From that week on, Max spent his days in my room, or in the small patch of yard behind the kitchen. He didn't complain, dogs don't, which is one of the things I've always respected about them. But he started waiting by my door every morning with a patience that hurt me to look at, like he was making sure I hadn't forgotten him. "I haven't forgotten you," I told him every morning. I never would. Summer wore on. Daniel started coming home later. When he did come home, he was somewhere else inside his own head, phone in hand, thumbs moving half present at dinner, in a way that reminded me of nothing so much as a man running a calculation he couldn't quite finish. One Saturday in July, I tried to tell him about a red oak I'd spotted in the park, 2 blocks over a beautiful old tree with a canopy wide as a house. I told him it reminded me of the tree line back on the Harlan property. He looked up from his phone. "That's great, Dad," he said. Then he looked back down. My chest tightened like a hand had closed around it. I picked up my fork and kept eating. In August, Vanessa's college friend Lisa came to visit for a long weekend. I heard Vanessa showing her around the house, the new kitchen renovation, the nursery she'd decorated herself, the reading nook she'd built into the upstairs landing. All of it described in her voice with her choices, her taste. Then I heard Lisa ask, "And who's staying with you?" "My father-in-law," Vanessa said. Her voice shifted just slightly, just enough. "He's here temporarily." I was standing at the top of the stairs. I heard that word, and I felt it the way you feel a splinter, small, sharp, working its way deeper than it has any right to go. Temporarily. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. Max put his head in my lap and looked up at me with those soft brown eyes. "It's fine," I told him. "She just means until things settle." Max made a sound low in his throat. Not quite a whine, more like disagreement. "Don't look at me like that," I said. But that evening, I found myself going to my volley that old blue suitcase I'd brought from Harlan, and checking for something. My fingers found the folded paper near the bottom tucked inside the lining where I kept things I didn't want to misplace. I pulled it out and unfolded it on the bed. Daniel's signature, Ruth's signature, the date, the amount, to be repaid upon request. I had put it there the day I arrived in Nashville, the same way I always filed important papers quietly, without making a point of it, the way a man takes care of business without needing anyone to notice. I folded it back up carefully and put it away. Then I heard Vanessa's voice drifting up from the kitchen below, low and deliberate. Daniel was home by then, and though I couldn't make out every word, I caught enough. This was supposed to be temporary Daniel, and Daniel's voice softer, giving ground, the way water gives ground to stone. I know, Nessa, I know. Just give it a little more time." I sat on that bed with Max pressed warm against my side and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time my son had used the word temporary to describe anything in his own life. He hadn't, not once, only mine. September in Nashville comes in like it can't make up its mind. Some mornings the air was still heavy and warm, thick with the last breath of summer. Other mornings you'd step outside and feel that first edge of autumn cutting through sharp and honest the way cold always is. I had been up since 5. That's my hour always has been going back to 30 years of workshop mornings when the best light came early and the wood waited for no one. I'd made coffee in the kitchen, poured it into the blue mug Daniel had bought me 2 Christmases ago, and settled at the counter to watch Nashville wake up through the window above the sink. Max was under the kitchen table, chin on his paws, tracking me with his eyes the way he does when he's decided I need supervising. Daniel's phone was on the counter beside the toaster. He'd come downstairs, half-dressed, 20 minutes earlier, grabbed a glass of water, and disappeared back upstairs to finish getting ready for work. The phone sat there, screen down, the way he always left it. Then it lit up. I wasn't trying to read it. I want to be clear about that. The screen flared bright right in front of my coffee cup, and the preview loaded before I had any chance to look away. A text from Vanessa sent to what looked like a group thread, and the first line sat there on that screen like a stone dropped into still water. "Once Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment." My coffee mug stopped halfway to my mouth. I set it down very carefully on the counter. I picked up the phone. I told myself I was just checking the name of the thread, just making sure I'd read it right, and I stopped making excuses to myself and scrolled up. The thread was from February, 8 months ago. 2 months before Daniel had called me in Harlan with his warm voice and his talk about family and taking care of me in my old age. The conversation was between Daniel and Vanessa, and it read the way a business plan reads: clean, practical, forward-looking. "Daniel, Once Dad sells the land, we'll finally have the down payment. Vanessa, how long is a while? Daniel. Until we get the money sorted, then we figure it out. Vanessa, how long is that going to take? Daniel, not long. He'll do it if I ask right. I read it 4 times. 4. Each time hoping I'd misread something mistaken, the tone missed some context that would make it mean something different. The 4th time I read it the same way I read it the first time, like a man finding a crack in the foundation of something he'd built his whole life on. He'll do it if I ask right. My grip on the arms of the chair tightened until my knuckles ached. Not from cold, not from age, from something I had carried quietly for months and was only now being permitted to set down. From something had no good name for, not quite anger, not quite grief, something that lived in the space between the two, hot and hollow at the same time. I put the phone back down on the counter, exactly where it had been. Exactly the same angle. Then I stood at that sink and looked out the window at the backyard. The tomato plants I'd put in back in May, heavy with fruit now. In the September warmth, the fence gate. I'd rehung the little patch of lawn I'd edged neat with a borrowed tool, and I thought about what it meant to pour yourself into something that was never meant to hold you. I heard Daniel on the stairs. I turned on the faucet and rinsed my mug, my back to the room. My face doing the thing faces have to do sometimes, when you need to keep them from saying what your mind is screaming. Daniel came in behind me. I heard him pick up his phone, heard the small sound of him checking it, pocketing it. "Morning, Dad," he said. His voice was the same as always, ordinary, easy. I turned off the faucet and turned around. I looked at my son, really looked at him the way I had on that rainy night, searching for someone I recognized. I found him. That was the worst part. He was right there, my boy, my Daniel, the kid with the truck pajamas who used to sit on a stool in my workshop, asking why wood had a smell. He was right there inside that 44-year-old face, and he had no idea what I had just read, and he was looking at me like everything was exactly what it appeared to be. "Morning, son," I said. "Coffee's ready." He poured himself a cup, kissed the top of Liam's head, as Vanessa came downstairs with the baby and was out the front door by 7:15. Just like every other morning, I stood in that kitchen for a long time after he left. Long enough for the coffee to go cold. Long enough for Max to get up from under the table and press himself against my leg, which is what he does when he knows something is wrong, before I've admitted it to myself. "I know," I said to him. My voice came out low and rough, scraped thin by everything I was holding back. "I know." I didn't cry. I want to tell you I held it together because I was strong, but that's not quite right. I held it together because something inside me had gone very still, the way a workshop goes, still in the early morning, before you pick up the first tool, when everything is potential and nothing has been cut yet, and you're deciding what this piece of wood is going to become. I walked upstairs to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. Max jumped up beside me, something he only did when I needed it, and put his big, gray-muzzled head in my lap. I sat there with my hand on my dog's back, feeling his breathing slow and steady and honest. And for the first time since I'd moved to Nashville, I let myself ask the question I had been building walls around for months. Did my son ever want me here at all? Or was I just the down payment? The answer sat in my chest like a splinter too deep to reach with your fingers. I could feel it. I just couldn't get to it yet. But I was starting to look. When you spend 40 years working with wood, you learn to read things that haven't happened yet. A crack in the grain that looks small today will split the whole board in 6 months if you don't address it. A joint that feels tight in summer will loosen when winter dries the air. You learn to see where things are going before they get there. After that September morning in the kitchen, I started reading Vanessa the same way I read wood, and what I saw made my stomach turn. It started with small things, the kind you dismiss once, twice, 3 times, before you understand they aren't small at all. Vanessa had a habit of stepping out to the back deck to take certain phone calls. I had noticed it before and thought nothing of it. But now I started paying attention to when those calls came. They came in clusters. 2 or 3 in a week, then nothing for a few days, then another cluster. Always the same, her voice low, her back to the house, one hand gesturing the way it did when she was making a point to someone who was pushing back. One afternoon in late September, I was at the kitchen table reading when Vanessa came in from the backyard, phone in hand, and set her laptop open on the counter to check something quickly. She was in a hurry. Liam had started crying upstairs, and she left the screen open when she went up. I was not trying to write it, but the subject line was right there 3 feet from where I was sitting, in a font big enough that a man with reading glasses didn't have to lean in. Re-property listing inquiry, Belle Mead. I felt the blood drain from my face. Vanessa was back downstairs in under 2 minutes with Liam on her hip. She saw me at the table, and for just a fraction of a second, the kind of fraction you can only catch if you're looking for it, her eyes went to the laptop, then back to me. Then she walked to the counter and closed it smooth and unhurried, like she was just tidying up. "How's Liam doing?" I asked. "Fine," she said, her voice perfectly level. "Just needed his pacifier." She took the baby into the living room. I sat at that table and stared at the wall and felt every piece of the last 6 months rearrange itself into a shape I could finally read. 2 days later, Patricia Howell came to visit. I had met Vanessa's mother exactly 3 times before that day. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s, hair colored a shade of auburn that didn't belong to her natural year's jewelry, that announced itself before she entered a room. The walk of a woman who had spent decades deciding she was the most important person wherever she went. She and Vanessa had the same way of looking at a space, quick assessing, already calculating what could be different. She arrived on a Saturday morning while Daniel was at the office. I was in the backyard with Max when I heard her come in through the front. Through the screen door, I could hear them moving through the house together, Patricia's voice carrying the way it always did. "This kitchen is bigger than I remembered," Patricia said. "We had the island extended last year," Vanessa told her. "Smart. That adds value." A pause. Then footsteps moving through toward the living room. "And the ceilings in here, what are those 9 feet? 9.5. That sound Patricia made like an appraiser marking a box. "The market's good right now in this neighborhood, honey. It really is. You don't want to sit on something like this too long." I stood very still in the backyard, Max pressed against my knee, and listened to Vanessa's mother walk through my son's house, the house my money had helped buy, and talk about it like it was a commodity waiting to be liquidated. "I know," Vanessa said. Her voice was quieter than her mother's, but certain. "I just need a little more time to sort some things out." "What things?" A pause just long enough to mean something. Then the situation upstairs. My jaw tightened so hard my back teeth ached. I was the situation upstairs. I walked Max down to the far end of the yard away from the house and stood by the fence until I heard Patricia's car pull away an hour later. When I came back inside, Vanessa was in the kitchen feeding Liam, and she looked at me with a smile so polished it could have been cut from glass. "George, I hope we didn't disturb you. Mom just stopped by for a quick visit." "Not at all," I said. "Nice to see her." I went upstairs. My legs felt like someone had replaced the bones with lead pipe. I sat on my bed and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes until the pressure gave me something to focus on, other than the heat building behind my sternum. She was going to sell the house. I didn't have proof yet, not the kind you could put in front of a lawyer. But I had 40 years of reading grain and stress lines and hidden cracks, and I knew what I had just seen. The house my money had helped buy was being positioned for a sale, and I was the last piece of the puzzle that needed to be moved out of the way before it could happen. I went to the volley. My hands found the paper without having to look. I pulled it out and unfolded it on my knee, his name at the bottom. Ruth's name below it as witness. The date in April. $47,000. And that one line I had added at the very end, the line he had signed without reading, to be repaid upon request. Then I folded it back up. I put it in my shirt pocket this time. Not the volley. My shirt pocket. Close. I looked at Max across the room. His tail moved once slow. "We're going to need that paper, buddy," I said quietly. He put his head down on his paws and watched me with those soft brown eyes that had never once lied to me in 10 years. Outside, a car rolled past on the quiet Belmead street. A leaf came loose from the tree by the window and spiraled down. Autumn was coming in for real now, and something in me, something old and patient and not yet finished, was getting ready. We're at the halfway point, and things are about to shift in a direction Daniel never saw coming. Before I go any further, drop a comment right now and type "still here" so I know you're with me. Every single comment tells me this story is worth finishing, and trust me, the second half is where everything unravels. A gentle note. The story continuing from here contains fictional elements shaped for meaningful educational storytelling. If that's not for you, no hard feelings, you're free to step away anytime. But if you're staying, hold on tight. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the quiet, not the tense, held breath quiet of Daniel's house, the kind where you never quite knew what mood was waiting for you at the bottom of the stairs. This was different. Howard's house had the quiet of a place where nothing needed to be proven to anyone. Morning light was pressing soft and gray through the curtains. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked. Max was curled at the foot of the bed, and when I stirred, he lifted his head and looked at me with those steady brown eyes, tail making one slow sweep across the quilt. "We made it through the night," I told him. He put his chin back down, satisfied. I lay there for a few minutes, just breathing. My back ached the way it always did after a cold night, a deep, familiar grinding that I had long since accepted as the price of 72 years. Outside, I could hear Nashville beginning its morning, a delivery truck somewhere down the block, the distant hum of traffic on the boulevard, a dog barking 2 houses over. I was reaching for my phone on the nightstand when it rang in my hand. Ruth Coleman. I pressed the green button before the second ring finished. "Ruth." "George." Her voice was sharp and warm at the same time, the way it always was, the voice of a woman who had been up for hours and had been deciding something during all of them. "How are you? Where are you?" "Howard's place," I said. "I'm all right." "Good." A breath of relief I could hear across the line. "Good. I've been up since 4 worrying about you, you stubborn old man." Despite everything, a small something loosened in my chest at that. "You didn't have to lose sleep over me." "Well, I did, so that ship has sailed." A short pause. "George, I need to tell you what happened last night. All of it. From the beginning." I pushed myself up against the headboard and listened. Ruth had been visiting her niece, a young woman named Carla, who lived 2 houses down the block from Daniel, in the same Belmead neighborhood, a fact she hadn't mentioned to me when I moved in because she hadn't thought it relevant until last night. She had been looking out Carla's front window when she saw the light change on Daniel's porch. She had watched Daniel open the front door. She had watched him set my suitcase down on the front walk. "I saw everything, George," she said, and her voice dropped half a register, the way voices do when someone is trying to hold themselves together. "I saw you pick up that suitcase. I saw you walk out into that rain with Max. I saw that door close behind you." My throat tightened. I turned toward the window and held very still, the way a man holds still when the wrong movement might break something he cannot afford to break just then. "Ruth, I had my phone out before that door finished closing," she said, and her voice went fierce and steady like a woman who had made up her mind and dared the world to argue with her. "I recorded it, George, from Carla's front porch. You, the suitcase, Max, the whole thing. Clear as day, even in the rain." I pulled in a slow breath. "You recorded it. Every second of it. And then I called Howard because I knew you'd sit on those steps all night before you'd ask anyone for help, and I was not about to let that happen. I rubbed my jaw with my free hand. The stubble rasped under my palm. Outside, the delivery truck had moved further down the street. Max had shifted and was now watching me from the foot of the bed, with his ears slightly forward, reading the conversation from my end of it. "I don't know what to say to you," I told Ruth. "You don't have to say anything, just listen." Another pause, and then her voice shifted softer, more careful, the way she used to talk to me in the weeks right after Margaret passed, when she'd show up with food and not make me talk about it. "George, what do you want to do? Not what you think you should do. Not what's going to make things easier for Daniel. What do you actually want?" Oh, nobody had asked me that in a very long time. The question sat in my chest and expanded slowly, like a knot of green wood finally releasing its tension. "I want what's fair," I said. The words came out quiet but certain, the way things come out when you've been thinking them without knowing it. "Not revenge, Ruth. I don't want to burn anything down. I just want what's fair. I put $47,000 of my life's work into that house. I need Daniel to understand you can't do what he did and walk away from it without consequence." Ruth was quiet for a beat, the thinking kind, not the empty kind. Then she said, "Then you need a lawyer, George. And I think I know exactly who." "I don't know anything about lawyers." "You don't need to know anything. You just need to walk in the door and tell the truth." A small sound that was almost a laugh. "You've been doing that your whole life. Shouldn't be too hard." "Who is she?" "Eleanor Hayes. She has an office downtown, overlooks the Cumberland. She handled my cousin's property dispute 3 years ago, and she fought like a woman with something personal at stake. Sharp as a tack, and she does not suffer fools." A pause. "I already called her this morning, George. She can see you Thursday." My chest ached with something I couldn't name cleanly, gratitude and grief braided together so tight I couldn't pull them apart. This woman had lost sleep over me, had stood at a window in the rain and pulled out her phone, had called Howard and a lawyer before I'd even thought to call anyone. "Ruth," I said, "why do you always—" "Because Margaret would have done the same for me," she said. Simple, final. The kind of answer that closes a door gently so no one has to feel the click. I swallowed hard. My eyes burned in a way I hadn't let them burn in years, a deep hot pressure behind the bridge of my nose that I forced back with everything I had. "All right," I managed. Thursday. Howard knows where the office is." Her voice gentled. "And George eat something this morning. You sound like a man running on coffee and stubbornness." "That's accurate," I said. She laughed, a real one, short and bright, and it was the best sound I had heard since I walked out of that house into the rain. After I hung up, I sat there with the phone in my lap, and Max watching me from across the quilt. I looked down at him, at that old gray-muzzled face that had never once let me down, and I felt something settle in my bones like timber finding its level after a long haul. "We've got a name, buddy," I said. "Eleanor Hayes." Max's tail swept the quilt once, slow and deliberate, like an old judge bringing down a gavel. Howard's car smelled like leather and old coffee, and a faint trace of sawdust that I suspected came from the blanket he kept folded on the back seat, the one he used to wrap finished pieces when he transported them to clients. Some things about a man stay the same no matter how successful he gets, and with Howard, it was always the sawdust. He drove me downtown on a Thursday morning in late October. The trees along West End Avenue had gone full amber, and rust leaves letting go in the dry breeze and skittering across the windshield like they had somewhere important to be. Nashville in autumn has a particular quality of light gold and a little melancholy, like something beautiful that knows it's temporary. I had my old blue suitcase in the back seat with Max. Not because I needed everything in it, but because the paper was inside, and I wasn't letting that paper out of my sight. Howard pulled into the parking garage below a glass office building that looked out over the Cumberland River. He turned off the engine and looked at me. "You ready for this?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "but I'm going anyway." He nodded like that was the right answer. "I'll be in the lobby. Take as long as you need." Eleanor Hayes's office was on the 14th floor. The elevator opened into a small waiting room with good furniture and a window that framed the Cumberland like a painting, the river gray-green in the morning light, a barge moving slow and heavy downstream. A young assistant showed me in without making me wait, which I appreciated. I had spent enough time waiting in my life. Eleanor Hayes was not what I expected. I think I had pictured someone older, a grandmother type, white-haired and reassuring. Eleanor was in her late 40s, dark hair pulled back clean, reading glasses pushed up on her head like she'd forgotten them there. She wore a charcoal blazer and the kind of focused expression that made me feel immediately like I was the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. She stood when I came in and reached across the desk to shake my hand. A real handshake, firm and brief, the kind that meant something. "Mr. Miller," she said, "sit down. Tell me everything. And don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad." I sat. I put the suitcase on the chair beside me. I told her everything from the phone call in April inviting me to Nashville to selling the land to the paper I'd written by hand at the notary's office to the tin message I'd read on Daniel's phone screen, to the email subject line on Vanessa's laptop, to Patricia walking through that house like she was pricing it. I talked for close to 40 minutes, and Eleanor did not interrupt me once. She sat forward with her elbows on the desk, and her eyes on my face, and she listened the way very few people know how to listen, like every word was a piece of evidence she was cataloging in real time. When I finished, I reached into the suitcase and put the paper on her desk. She picked it up. Read it once. Read it again. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something sharpened behind her eyes, the look of someone finding the exact tool they needed. "Ruth Coleman's signature as witness," she said. "She was there when Daniel signed it." She offered. "That's very good, Mr. Miller." "That is very good." She set the paper down carefully, the way you set down something fragile. "How much was the total?" $47,000. She made a note. Then she turned to her computer, typed something, waited. Her eyes moved across the screen. Then she looked up at me over the top of her reading glasses, which had migrated back down to the bridge of her nose. "George, can I call you George? Please." "George." I pulled the deed and the mortgage records for the Belle Meade property this morning, once Ruth called me. She folded her hands on the desk. "Your name appears on the original co-signer agreement filed at the time of the loan application, but approximately 4 months after closing that agreement was amended. Your name was removed." My chest went tight. "Can they do that?" "Not without your written consent, which I'm going to assume they did not have. I never signed anything like that. Then Daniel or someone acting on his behalf removed you from that agreement without your knowledge." She let that land for a moment before continuing. "Now I want to be clear with you about what this means practically. It doesn't give you ownership of the property. The house is titled in Daniel and Vanessa's names, but it does give us an additional breach of contract argument that strengthens your civil case considerably." I leaned forward. "What exactly is our civil case?" Eleanor picked up a pen and tapped it once against the notepad. "We file suit in Davidson County Circuit Court. We present the promissory note, that's the paper you wrote by hand, and yes, it qualifies as a legally binding promissory note in Tennessee, and we argue that Daniel borrowed $47,000 from you with an explicit agreement to repay it upon request. We request repayment plus statutory interest plus legal fees." She paused. "There is one more thing I need to discuss with you, and I need your honest answer before we go further." "Go ahead." She set down the pen. "When Daniel applied for the mortgage, he was required to disclose the source of his down payment funds on his loan application. If he listed your $47,000 as a family gift rather than a loan, which the promissory note proves it was, Then he filed a false statement on a federally backed mortgage application. She looked at me steadily. That is mortgage fraud, George. It's a federal offense. The words landed in the room and stayed there. I looked at the surface of her desk, the grain of the wood, dark walnut, well made. I noticed things like that without meaning to. What does that mean for Daniel? I asked. My voice came out careful and low. It means if I report it to the lender or to federal authorities, it triggers a separate investigation entirely. Criminal exposure. Potential prosecution. She kept her eyes on mine. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer from your gut, not from what you think you're supposed to say. Do you want to hurt your son, or do you want justice? I didn't need to think about it. The answer was already sitting in my chest, had been sitting there since the morning I read those text messages at the kitchen counter. Justice, I said. I don't want him in prison. I don't want to destroy him. I want him to understand what he did to me, to himself, to everything I built to give him a decent life. My jaw was tight, but my voice was steady. Can you do that without the federal piece? Eleanor picked up the pen again and a new legal pad. She uncapped it with a small, precise click. Yes, she said. We use the mortgage fraud as leverage only. If Daniel cooperates and satisfies the judgment, it never goes further. If he fights us or obstructs, then we revisit. She looked up. All right, George, let's begin. I sat back in that chair and felt something release in my shoulders that had been wound tight since September. Outside the window behind her head, the Cumberland moved on under the gray October sky, carrying everything downstream, the way rivers always do, patient, indifferent, unstoppable. I was 72 years old, and I had never hired a lawyer in my life. But I had spent 40 years learning that the right tool used correctly could bring out what a piece of wood was always meant to be. Eleanor Hayes was the right tool, and I was not done yet. 2 weeks passed between my first meeting with Eleanor and the phone call that brought me back to her office. 2 weeks of mornings in Howard's guest room, of long walks with Max along the Richland Creek Greenway, while the last of Nashville's autumn leaves came down in slow spirals. 2 weeks of evenings in Howard's small workshop, behind the house where I'd been allowed to use the bench and the tools, running my hands over wood, the way other men run their hands over old photographs, looking for something familiar to hold on to. Eleanor's call came on a Wednesday afternoon, and she used the same 4 words she'd used the first time, just rearranged. George, I need you to come in. Howard drove me. Same parking garage, same elevator. But when I walked into Eleanor's office this time, the desk was covered. Folders, printed emails, photographs of documents, all of it fanned out in a way that told me she had been working, and working hard. She looked up when I came in, and there was something different in her expression, not excited exactly, focused the way a surgeon looks before they make the first cut. She gestured to the chair. Sit down, she said. We have more than I expected. I sat, my hands pressed flat on my thighs. How much more? Enough. She picked up the first folder. I'll go in order. Stop me if anything doesn't make sense. She opened to a printed document, a real estate listing agreement bearing Vanessa's signature at the bottom. I could see it clearly from where I sat, her name, her looping cursive, unmistakable. This is a listing agreement signed by Vanessa Miller, Eleanor said. It was submitted to a licensed real estate agency operating in the Belle Meade area in August of this year, 2 months before you were asked to leave the property. She looked at me steadily. Daniel's signature is not on this document. I leaned forward slightly. She can do that sign without him. No, she cannot. The property is titled in both names under Tennessee's tenancy by the entirety statute. Any contract to sell or list the property requires both signatures. This document is not legally enforceable. Eleanor set it down. But that's not why it matters to us. It matters because it establishes intent. Vanessa Miller was actively attempting to sell the property 2 months before the confrontation with you, which means your removal from the house was not an impulsive reaction to muddy paw prints. It was a step in a plan. The air in the room felt heavier. I kept my jaw from tightening by sheer force of habit. "What else?" I asked. Eleanor opened the second folder. Inside was a printed email chain, several pages, the kind of correspondence that builds over weeks. "This is the communication between Vanessa and the listing agent. I obtained it through a formal discovery request." She turned the top page so I could read the relevant section, her finger underlining one line. I read it. My vision went slightly blurry at the edges for a moment, and I blinked it clear. The line read, "We're very close to being ready. Just need the old man situation resolved first." "The old man situation," I said. My voice came out very flat. "That is how she described you to her real estate agent." Eleanor's voice was even and professional, but her eyes were sharp with something that looked like controlled anger. "There is more in the chain. The listing agent's response asked for a timeline. Vanessa replied that she expected things to be resolved within 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks, the same window as the rainy October night. How did she find the agent?" I asked. I needed to keep asking questions because questions kept me from doing something I'd regret, like putting my fist through the walnut desk. Eleanor turned to the third page of the email chain. The introduction came via email. Vanessa's mother, Patricia Howell, forwarded the agent's contact information with a note that read, "This is the one I mentioned. He's discreet." She looked up. Discreet in this context appears to mean willing to proceed with an incomplete signature set, which is a problem for the agent's license, but not our primary concern right now. I pressed my thumb and forefinger into my eye sockets and held them there for a moment. Hard enough to see the pressure as light. Patricia. Patricia, who had walked through that house measuring the walls. Patricia, who had told her daughter the market was good and not to wait too long. "George." Eleanor's voice shifted, still steady but gentler. "I need to ask you something before we go further. What do you want to know about Daniel?" I lowered my hands. "What do you mean? The listing agreement is in Vanessa's name only. Daniel did not sign it. That tells me one of two things: either he genuinely didn't know about it, or he chose to maintain plausible deniability." She folded her hands. "Which one do you believe?" The question hit me somewhere very deep. I thought about my son's voice saying "temporary" in the kitchen. I thought about the text message, "He'll do it if I ask right." I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me the night he threw me out, not at my eyes, at the floor. Like he couldn't quite carry the weight of his own actions if he had to see my face at the same time. "I think," I said slowly, "that Daniel knew enough and chose not to look at the rest." My throat felt thick. He's not the one who planned it down to the phone calls and the real estate agent. But he opened the door and let it happen. I looked at Eleanor. "Does that matter legally?" "For the civil suit, not much. Your case is against both of them as a household, but it matters for something else." She held my gaze. "When this is over, if there's ever going to be anything left between you and your son, he needs to understand exactly how much he chose to not know." I stood up from the chair and walked to the window. The Cumberland was doing what it always did, moving brown-green and steady, carrying everything downstream without complaint. My reflection hovered faint against the glass, an old man in a flannel shirt standing in a lawyer's office, and I thought about how strange it was that this was my life now. "She was going to sell the house I paid for," I said. The words felt like gravel in my mouth. "With my own money in the foundation, and my son let her aim at it." Behind me, I heard Eleanor pick up a pen. "George," she said, "there's one more thing. About Daniel's job. And when I tell you, I need you to hear it all the way through before you react." I turned from the window. My chest was tight, and my eyes were hot, and I was 72 years old, and I was done being surprised by my own capacity to hurt. "Tell me," I said. Eleanor poured coffee before she sat back down. 2 cups, one for herself, one she slid across the desk to me without asking. I wrapped both hands around it. Not because I was cold, because I needed something solid to hold. When Daniel applied for the mortgage on the Belle Meade property, she began, he was required to complete a uniform residential loan application. That's a standard federal form. Every mortgage in this country goes through one. Among the questions on that form is a section asking the borrower to disclose the source of their down payment funds. I kept my eyes on her. My hands stayed around the coffee cup. Daniel listed your $47,000 as a family gift, she said. Not a loan, a gift. I set the cup down on the desk. But I have the paper. Exactly. You have a signed promissory note clearly stating the money was a loan to be repaid upon request, which means Daniel knowingly filed a false statement on a federally backed mortgage application. She let that sit for exactly one breath before continuing. That is called mortgage fraud, George. Under federal law, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 1014, making a false statement on a loan application to a federally insured bank is a criminal offense. It carries potential fines and imprisonment. The room felt very still. I heard the ventilation system running somewhere above the ceiling. Outside, a cloud moved across the sun, and the light through the window changed, going flat and gray for a moment, before brightening again. Why did he do it that way? I asked. My voice was controlled, but my jaw ached from holding it steady. Because if he disclosed it as a loan, the bank would have counted it as existing debt, reducing his debt-to-income ratio and potentially disqualifying him from the loan amount he needed. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, the way doctors describe diagnoses. By calling it a gift, he made the numbers look clean. The bank approved him. He got the house. She paused. Your money made that possible, and he lied to a federal institution to make sure no one would ever come looking for it back. I stood up. I didn't mean to. My legs just decided they needed to be vertical. I walked to the window again. That window had been getting a lot of use from me lately. The Cumberland was still there, still moving. I focused on that for a moment. Water that kept going no matter what foolish things human beings did on the banks. George. Eleanor's voice came from behind me, quiet but clear. I need your answer before I take the next step. If I report this to the lender or to the FBI's mortgage fraud division, it triggers a federal investigation. Daniel could face criminal charges entirely separate from our civil suit. A pause. That is your call, not mine. I turned around. My chest was burning, the kind of burn that comes from swallowing something too hot. Not anger at Eleanor, not anger at the law. Anger at the picture. At a 44-year-old man sitting at a desk, filling out a federal form, writing the word gift over a box that should have said loan because it was easier and nobody would check, and the old man back in Harlan would never know the difference. No federal, I said. The words came out hard and final as hammer on nail. I don't want my son in a federal courtroom. I don't want him in any courtroom in handcuffs. My voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough to remind me I was still a father underneath all of this. But I want it on the table. I want him to know that I know. And I want Eleanor Hayes to make sure that if he fights us, if he drags this out and makes it ugly, then we revisit. Eleanor nodded once. Understood. We use it as leverage only. It goes no further unless he forces our hand. She picked up a fresh legal pad. Then here is how we proceed. She walked me through it in clear ordered steps, the way I liked things, the way a good set of plans laid out a build from foundation to roof. She would send a formal demand letter to Daniel's home address and to his attorney of record if he had one. The letter would state the amount owed, $47,000, plus statutory interest accrued since the date of transfer, and demand repayment within 30 days. It would reference the promissory note, Ruth Coleman's witness signature, and the cosigner removal without consent. It would not mention the mortgage fraud by name, but would note that additional matters had come to Eleanor's attention and reserved the right to raise them in court if necessary. Anyone who had ever dealt with legal language would understand exactly what that line meant. 30 days, I said, and if he doesn't pay, we file in Davidson County Circuit Court. The discovery process begins. The bank statements, the listing agreement, the emails, all of it becomes part of the formal record. She looked at me over her glasses. Daniel is a financial analyst, George. He knows what a formal discovery process looks like from the inside. He knows what happens when those documents start surfacing. I picked up the pen she slid across the desk. The authorization form was 2 pages clean, precise, exactly the kind of document I understood. This is what I'm agreeing to. These are the boundaries. This is what it means. I read every line. I had learned my lesson about signing things without reading them, even if the lesson had come from watching my son make that mistake. I signed at the bottom. My handwriting was steady. 72 years old, and my hand still knew how to hold a pen. Howard was waiting in the lobby when I came down. He looked up from his phone when the elevator opened. One look at my face and he stood. "How'd it go?" he asked. "She's sending the letter," I said. He nodded slowly. We walked to the car together. Outside, the air had a bite to it, real November cold coming down off the hills, the kind that smelled like wood smoke and coming winter. It smelled faintly like Harlan. That evening, Howard let me into the workshop. I found a piece of white oak in the rack, thick, straight-grained, still carrying the smell of the tree it came from. I set it on the bench and picked up the handplane and started working. The first stroke sent a thin curl of wood spiraling up and over. The second, the third, my shoulders found the old rhythm before my mind caught up with it, the push, the angle, the slight adjustment for the grain. The workshop filled with the smell I had grown up inside. Oak and sawdust and cold air, and the particular peace that comes from doing one simple thing correctly over and over until the noise in your head has nowhere left to live. Max lay beside the bench, chin on his paws, breathing slow and even. Outside, somewhere across Nashville, a demand letter was being drafted with my name on it, pointed at my son's front door. And in a small workshop on a cold November night, an old man ran his hand along a piece of oak and felt for the first time in a long time that the grain was straight and the work was honest, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The demand letter left Eleanor's office on a Tuesday, sent by certified mail to the Belle Meade address. Eleanor had also filed the civil complaint with Davidson County Circuit Court the same morning, because Daniel had not responded in any way to a preliminary notice she had sent the week before, and Eleanor Hayes was not a woman who waited past her own deadlines. I knew the letter would arrive by Thursday at the latest. Ruth called me Friday morning. I was in Howard's kitchen, standing at the window with my second cup of coffee, watching a pair of cardinals work over the bird feeder in the backyard. Max was sitting beside me, following the birds, with his eyes the way old dogs do, interested, unhurried, no longer inclined to chase anything. "George." Ruth's voice had that particular tightness to it, the sound of someone who had witnessed something and was still processing it. "It arrived yesterday. I saw the mail carrier." I set my coffee down. "Tell me." I was at Carla's again. She asked me to stay an extra week, and honestly, I wasn't about to leave Nashville until I knew how this was going. A breath. The certified mail truck came at about 2 in the afternoon. Daniel was working from home. I could see his car in the driveway. He came out to sign for it himself. I kept my eyes on the cardinals. What did he do? He stood on the porch and opened it right there. Ruth's voice was careful, measured, like she was reading from notes she'd made in her head. "George, I've seen a lot of men receive bad news in my life." His face went white. Not gradually all at once, like somebody turned off a light behind his eyes. My chest tightened. I pressed my free hand flat against the countertop. "He read it twice," Ruth continued. Then he went inside. About 5 minutes later, Vanessa came to the front door. She must have seen his face, and he handed her the letter. I watched her read it. And George? I couldn't make out her face clearly from where I was standing, but I could see her through the glass. Her whole posture changed the second she read it. She went rigid. You could see it even from 2 houses down the way. A person's shoulders lock up when something hits them wrong. She said something to him and walked back inside without another word. She said something to Daniel. I couldn't hear the words and went back inside. Patricia, I asked. Called within the hour. I saw her car pull up. She was inside for 45 minutes. A pause. She did not look happy when she left. I almost said something then. Almost. But Ruth wasn't finished. George, I need to show you something. Can I come by Howard's this afternoon? She arrived at 3 o'clock with her phone in her hand. We sat at Howard's kitchen table, Max between us on the floor, tail moving slow, and Ruth pulled up the video she had posted to a Nashville community Facebook group 3 weeks earlier. I had known she'd filmed it. I had known she'd posted it, but I had not watched it. She held the phone out to me. I took it. The video was 40 seconds long. Shot from Carla's front porch in the rain. Slightly shaky, the way phone videos taken in the dark always are, but clear enough. Clear enough to see the porch light over the front door. Clear enough to see the door open. Clear enough to see a blue suitcase set down on the front walk. Clear enough to see an old man in a flannel shirt bend down and pick it up, a dog pressing against his leg, rain coming down on both of them. Clear enough to see the door close. I watched it once. My throat closed up so completely that I had to swallow 3 times before I trusted myself to breathe normally. My eyes burned hot and sudden, and I did not try to stop it. This time I let the heat come, and I blinked it back, and I kept watching. That old man on the screen, that was me. 72 years old, standing in the rain with a suitcase and a dog, and nowhere to go, and the door closing behind him like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. How many people have seen it? I asked. My voice was rough at the edges. Last I checked, Ruth said, and her own voice had gone very gentle. A little over 80,000. I put the phone down on the table. Ruth reached over and put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm and dry and firm, the hand of a woman who had buried a husband and raised 3 children and still showed up when it mattered. It's all right, she said. Let people see it. My phone buzzed on the table. Eleanor's name. I opened the message. George Daniel's colleagues are finding the video. His name also appeared in the public court filing this morning. I'm getting signals from his attorney that they want to talk. Don't answer any calls from Daniel directly. Let everything go through me. I read it twice, set the phone face down, then it rang. The screen lit up even face down. I could see the glow leaking out from under it. I turned it over. Daniel, the name sat there pulsing with each ring. 3 rings. 4. I looked at it the way you look at something that used to mean everything, and now means something different, not less exactly. Different. Heavier. Ruth watched me. She did not tell me what to do. That was the thing about Ruth. She trusted a man to make his own decisions when he was ready to make them. The phone rang a 5th time, then stopped. I put it back face down on the table. Not yet, I said quietly. Ruth nodded once slowly, like that was the right answer. Max put his head on my knee, heavy and warm, and I left my hand on his back and felt his breathing go in and out while the kitchen settled back into its afternoon quiet. But somewhere across Nashville, my son had just set down an empty box in a parking garage and walked to his car alone. And I didn't know that yet, wouldn't know it, until Eleanor called the next morning. But some part of me, that old part that had always been able to read grain before the crack appeared, already felt it coming. Eleanor called on a Monday morning, the first week of December. Outside Howard's kitchen window, Nashville had finally given in to winter. The trees along the street were bare and black against a sky the color of old pewter, and there was a cold in the air that had nothing to do with temperature, the kind of cold that settles into old joints and stays. I had been up since 5 as always, but I hadn't gone out to the workshop yet. Something had kept me at the kitchen table with my coffee, waiting in that particular way a man waits when he knows a call is coming and doesn't know if he's ready for it. When the phone rang and Eleanor's name came up, I answered before the second ring finished. George. Her voice was measured the way it always was. But there was something underneath it, not satisfaction exactly. More like the sound of a door opening that couldn't be closed again. It's happening. My grip on the phone tightened. Tell me. Daniel was terminated from his position this morning. She paused one beat just long enough for the words to land. His company, a financial investment firm on Music Row, has an internal compliance team that monitors public court filings for employees' names. Our civil complaint became public record when we filed it last week. They found it within 48 hours. I pulled a slow breath in through my nose. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I hadn't noticed until that moment. The video also circulated through their office, Eleanor continued. Several colleagues forwarded it internally. Combined with the court filing, their compliance department opened an internal review. A pause. Daniel was let go from Meridian Financial this morning. They cited a violation of their public compliance and code of conduct policies. The civil filing became public record, and that was enough for them to act. I don't know what they found internally, and frankly, we don't need to. What matters is that this was their decision based on public information. We didn't report him to his employer. The court filing did that on its own. They didn't need the fraud charge, I said slowly. No. They used their own internal policy. It's cleaner that way for them, and frankly for us. We didn't trigger it. We didn't report him to his employer. The court filing was public record, and they found it on their own. Her voice was careful and precise. I want you to understand that, George, we filed a legal civil complaint. What happened after that was a consequence of Daniel's own choices, not something we engineered. I knew she was right. I knew it in my head. But knowing something in your head and carrying it in your chest are two different things entirely. And right then, my chest felt like something heavy was sitting on it. He emptied his desk, I said. Not a question. This morning, security escorted him out as is standard procedure in financial firms when an employee is terminated for compliance reasons. A breath. George, are you all right? Howard had come into the kitchen while I was on the phone. He'd seen my face and stopped by the counter, not moving closer, not leaving just there the way he'd always been there. I looked at him across the kitchen, and he looked back with those steady eyes that never demanded anything from you. I'll call you if I need anything, Eleanor, I said. Thank you. I put the phone on the table. Then I stood up and walked to the back door and stepped out onto Howard's rear porch. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and clean, the kind that clarifies things whether you want them clarified or not. I stood there in my flannel shirt, with my hands on the porch railing, looking out at the bare tree line, and I thought about my son. Not the 44-year-old man who had stood in a hallway and told me to take my dog and get out. I thought about the boy, the one who used to climb onto my workbench stool at 5 years old and ask me questions about go I barely knew how to answer. The one who cried when our first dog passed and tried to hide it because he thought I'd say, Miller men don't cry. And I'd never said that, had never once said that, but he was afraid of it anyway. The one who had driven away from Harlan County with his whole life ahead of him, and my whole life's savings pointed at his back like a blessing. My eyes burned. I let them burn. The cold air took the heat right out of them. Howard stepped out behind me. He stood beside me at the railing, shoulders level with mine, looking out at the same bare trees. He lost his job, I said. My voice came out rough and low, dragged over gravel. Yes, Howard said. I never wanted that. I know you didn't. I gripped the railing harder. The wood was cold under my palms, painted porch wood, not the good stuff, not what I would have used, but solid enough to hold on to. I wanted him to understand. That was all. I wanted him to look at what he did and understand it. Howard turned his head slightly toward me. George, his voice was very quiet. You filed a legal document. Everything after that, the job, the court record, the video, none of that is what you did to him. That is what his choices built, brick by brick for a long time. You just stopped standing in front of it. I stared at the tree line for a long moment. A crow landed on the top branch of the farthest oak and sat there black against the gray sky, looking down at whatever crows look at. I keep seeing him at 8 years old, I said. My voice cracked down the middle, and I let it. Sitting on that stool in my workshop, asking me why cherry wood smells like his grandmother's kitchen. A sound came out of my throat that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but lived somewhere between the two. How does a boy like that end up here? Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the same way most of them do, George. One small choice at a time. One thing they told themselves was fine when it wasn't. One door they walked through and didn't look back at. He put his hand on my shoulder, brief and firm. That's not on you. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Max had nosed the back door open and come to stand beside me, pressing his warm weight against my leg. I reached down and put my hand on his head. There's more to come, isn't there? I said. It wasn't a question. There usually is, Howard said. But you've got good people standing with you. And you've got that dog. I almost smiled at that. Almost. Back inside, I poured out the cold coffee and made a fresh pot. Outside, Nashville's first December sky pressed down gray and still, and the bare trees stood in it like they'd been standing in hard weather their whole lives, and had learned the way old things do to simply hold. The last thing Howard said to me that evening as I set down my chisel and watched the sawdust settle on the workbench floor was this: George, sometimes a man has to lose everything before he figures out what he actually had. I didn't answer him right away. I just picked up a rag, wiped my hands slowly, and thought about my son. 3 days had passed since Eleanor called to tell me Daniel had been let go from Meridian Financial. 3 days of quiet. No calls, no texts, not even a word from Ruth saying she'd spotted his car in the neighborhood. Just silence, the heavy, suffocating kind that settles in when something large is about to break. It broke on a Thursday morning. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at 7:30. I saw Daniel's name on the screen, and my heart did something it hadn't done in weeks. It lurched upward like a man grabbing a rope he wasn't sure would hold. I answered on the second ring. Dad. His voice cracked right down the middle of that one word. Just Dad and I could hear 3 months of pressure, humiliation, and sleepless nights packed into those 4 letters. I'm here, I said, sitting up slowly, my back aching the way it always does in cold weather. She's gone. His breath came in short, ragged pulls. Vanessa, she packed Liam's things last night while I was in the shower. I came out, and her suitcases were by the door. I asked her what she was doing, and she said... He stopped, voice breaking further. She said she didn't sign up to go down with a sinking ship. I pressed my hand flat against my chest, feeling the thud of my own heartbeat. Lord have mercy. Where did she go? I asked, keeping my voice steady for him, the way you hold a flashlight steady so someone else can find their way. Her mother's place. Patricia's. He laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that didn't have a drop of humor in it. You know what's funny? Dad, Patricia never liked me. From the day Vanessa brought me home, that woman looked at me like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe. And now Vanessa's running back to her with my son. Liam is her son too, I said gently, because it was true, and because Daniel needed to hear something true right then. I know that. His voice dropped to almost nothing. I know. I walked into his room this morning, and his stuffed elephant was still on the bed. She left it behind. She left Elliot behind. He let out a sound, then raw and wrecked, and I understood he wasn't just crying about a stuffed toy. He was crying about everything, about all of it. I gripped the phone tighter. My eyes stung something fierce, but I held on. "Daniel," I said after a moment, "are you safe? Do you have food in the house?" "I have half a bottle of whiskey and some crackers," he admitted. "That's not food, son. That's a bad decision waiting to happen." I swung my legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the cold floor. "You call your doctor today. You hear me? Not tomorrow. Today." "Dad, I'm not asking." My voice came out firmer than I intended, but it needed to. "You're my son, and I will not sit here and let you fall apart without at least trying to catch you. Call your doctor. Get dressed. Eat something real." There was a long pause on the line. Then, "Why are you being kind to me?" That question nearly undid me. Nearly. I felt my jaw tighten, felt the old grief and anger rise up in my throat like floodwater, but I swallowed it back down because this wasn't the moment for it. "Because you're my blood," I said quietly. "That doesn't turn off just because things got hard." He cried then. Not the polished, composed kind of crying, the ugly, full-body kind. The kind that comes from a place so deep inside a person that it bypasses every wall they've ever built. I stayed on the line. I didn't tell him it was going to be okay. I didn't make promises I couldn't keep. I just stayed. When he finally quieted, I heard him draw a long, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." I stared at the wall of Howard's guest room. Outside the window, a cardinal bright red against the gray December sky landed on the fence post and tipped its head to one side like it was listening too. "I know you are," I said, and I meant it. But I also knew that sorry on its own doesn't fix a broken foundation. It never has. You can be the most genuinely sorry man in the world and still owe a debt that words alone won't settle. That's a truth I'd learned from 40 years of woodworking. If you split a plank by forcing a nail in wrong, saying sorry to the wood doesn't make it whole again. You still have to do the work. "The hearing is next week," I told him because he needed to know it was coming. "Eleanor will be there. I'll be there." His breath caught sharply. "Dad, I didn't bring that lawsuit to hurt you, Daniel. I brought it because what happened was wrong, and I need you to understand the difference." He didn't argue. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe for the first time in months, the fog of Vanessa's influence had lifted just enough for him to see clearly. Ruth called me that afternoon. She'd driven past the Belle Meade house earlier in the day, she said, and seen a moving van parked along the curb. 2 men in gray uniforms loading furniture, a dresser, a child's bookshelf, boxes stacked 4 high. "She didn't waste any time," Ruth said, and her voice carried that particular edge of a woman who has seen betrayal up close and recognizes it on sight. "No," I agreed, watching Max stretch out at my feet, his old golden tail sweeping slowly across the hardwood. "She never did." That night, I sat in Howard's armchair, with Max's head heavy in my lap and a cup of tea gone cold on the side table. I thought about Daniel alone in that big, quiet house, Liam's stuffed elephant sitting on the bed. I thought about how a man can build something his whole life, a family, a name, a sense of who he is, and not realize how easily it splinters until the moment it does. I scratched Max behind his ear, and he let out a long, contented sigh. Next week, I thought. The hearing. I have been inside a lot of buildings in my 72 years. Tobacco warehouses in Harlan County that smelled of cured leaves and old wood. Hospital corridors that hummed with fluorescent lights and quiet fear. Churches where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. But I had never stood in a courtroom before the morning of December 19th, 2025. Davidson County Circuit Court sits on 2nd Avenue North in downtown Nashville, a building of pale stone and tall windows that doesn't try to hide what it is. There is something about a courthouse, the way the ceilings rise too high, the way every footstep echoes on the marble floor, that makes a man feel both small and strangely awake at the same time. Eleanor met me at the front steps at 8:15, carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through 100 rooms like this one. She shook my hand firmly, her dark eyes calm and focused behind wire-rimmed glasses. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like a man who doesn't belong here," I admitted. She gave me a small, measured smile. "You belong here exactly as much as the truth belongs here. And today, the truth has very good documentation." She patted her briefcase. "Let's go." Howard drove me. He sat in the back of the courtroom with his hands folded in his lap and his chin lifted slightly, the way a man sits when he wants the world to know he's not ashamed of where he is or who he's with. When I glanced back at him before taking my seat beside Eleanor, he gave me a single, solid nod. "I'm here." Daniel arrived 7 minutes after we did. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive clothes fit a man who has lost weight loose at the shoulders, the collar just a fraction too wide. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. The skin under his eyes was shadowed deep, and when he sat down at the opposite table beside his attorney, a man Eleanor later told me was named Craig Whitfield, he didn't look up. Not at me. Not at anyone. Craig Whitfield was polished in the way that defense attorneys sometimes are silver cufflinks, a practiced ease in his posture, a voice designed to sound reasonable even when the facts weren't. He opened by arguing that the $47,000 George provided had been a gift, a father's voluntary contribution to his son's future, and that no binding repayment obligation existed. Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood, straightened her jacket with one small, precise tug, and said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff has a promissory note bearing the defendant's signature, dated April 14th, 2025, witnessed by Ruth Coleman of Harlan County, Kentucky. The note specifies the principal amount of $47,000, the purpose of the loan, to serve as a down payment on a residential property at 418 Willowmere Drive, Nashville, Tennessee, and the repayment condition, quote, to be repaid in full upon demand or upon sale of the property, whichever occurs first. This is not a gift. This is a documented, witnessed, legally binding loan." She set the note on the clerk's desk with the quiet confidence of someone placing an ace on the table. Judge Ronald Gaines was a man in his late 60s, heavy-set with reading glasses perched low on his nose, and the expression of someone who has heard every version of every story and is no longer easily surprised. He studied the promissory note for a long moment, flipping the page, running his finger along Daniel's signature. Craig Whitfield tried again. "Your Honor, the document language is ambiguous." "Mr. Whitfield." Judge Gaines peered over his glasses. "The language states, to be repaid in full upon demand." A demand letter was sent via certified mail on November 28th. The defendant did not respond within the 30-day period. "I don't find the language ambiguous." My hands were trembling in my lap. I pressed them flat against my thighs. Eleanor continued. She presented the bank statement showing the precise $47,000 transfer from George's account, the proceeds of the Harlan County land sale, into Daniel's personal checking account on April 15th, one day after the note was signed. She presented the mortgage application for 418 Willowmere Drive, in which Daniel had listed the $47,000 as a personal gift, not a loan. She explained to Judge Gaines in plain and measured language that misrepresenting a loan as a gift on a residential mortgage application constitutes a material misstatement under federal lending guidelines, a matter she had reserved the right to refer to appropriate authorities separately should the defendant fail to satisfy today's judgment. At that, Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. His attorney leaned over and whispered something urgently. Daniel shook his head, a short, rigid motion. In addition, the plaintiff was named in a co-guarantor letter submitted to the lender at the time of the loan application, the document that helped qualify the down payment funds as legitimate. His name was removed from that letter approximately 6 weeks after closing through a filing submitted without his written acknowledgement. This removal, processed quietly through the lender's administrative channel, constitutes a breach of good faith in the original transaction and further establishes the defendant's deliberate effort to eliminate the plaintiff's documented standing. The courtroom was very quiet. I could hear the ventilation system humming above the ceiling tiles. I could feel Howard's steady presence somewhere behind me. I stared at the wood grain of the table in front of me and breathed. Judge Gaines set down his reading glasses and looked across the room at Daniel directly. "Mr. Miller," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was absolute. "Do you dispute the authenticity of the promissory note?" Daniel's throat moved. He looked down at the table for a moment, then back up at the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said. His voice was barely audible. "I don't." Craig Whitfield closed his eyes briefly, the way a man does when he understands a door has just closed. Judge Gaines ruled in my favor. Judgment for the plaintiff, $47,000 in principal plus statutory interest at the applicable rate from the date of demand, November 28th, 2025, and partial attorney's fees. Daniel had 90 days to satisfy the judgment, or Eleanor could move to enforce it through wage garnishment, property lien, or forced sale. When the gavel came down, the sound of it moved through me like a low note on a church organ, not triumphant, not joyful, but final. The way a closing hymn feels, like something has been named and set to rest. I turned to Eleanor. My eyes were burning. I pressed my lips together and nodded because words were somewhere beyond me just then. She put her hand briefly on my arm. "You did good, George." In the hallway outside, as the marble floor echoed with footsteps, and the high windows poured gray winter light across everything, I looked back toward the courtroom doors. Daniel emerged a moment later, Craig Whitfield walking close beside him, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Daniel wasn't listening. He stood in the middle of that hallway, people moving around him on both sides, and he looked at me. Just looked. His face held something I hadn't seen on him in years. Something stripped bare and undefended. Something that looked underneath all the wreckage like the boy who used to fall asleep in my truck on the drive home from Little League. Howard appeared at my shoulder and placed a hand there, warm and steadying. "You ready to go home?" I took one last look at my son standing in that courthouse hallway, the fluorescent light falling hard and honest across his face. "Yeah," I said quietly, "I'm ready." But even as I turned away, I knew the way you know a storm is coming, by the way the air shifts, that this wasn't the end between Daniel and me. The judgment was rendered. The law had done its part. What came next was something no courtroom in the world has the power to decide. He showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before Christmas. I heard the knock from the kitchen where I was sanding the edge of a small oak-side table Howard had asked me to finish. 3 knocks firm but uncertain, the way a man knocks when he's not sure he has the right to be standing at a door. I set down my sandpaper. My chest tightened in a way I recognized immediately. Max heard it too. He lifted his big golden head off his paws, ears perked forward, and let out a single soft sound. Not a bark, not a growl, just a low note of recognition deep in his throat. Then he was up, moving toward the front door, faster than I'd seen him move in months, his whole back end swaying with the effort. I followed him. When I opened the door, Daniel was standing on the porch steps with his hands tucked into the pockets of a gray jacket that looked too thin for December weather. He had lost more weight. His face was drawn, the cheekbones more prominent, the lines around his eyes deeper than a 44-year-old man's should be. But his eyes were clear, not the flat, guarded look he'd worn in that courthouse hallway. Clear, like a window someone had finally opened after a long winter. Before I could speak a single word, Max pushed past my legs and pressed his nose directly into Daniel's knee. Daniel's composure shattered instantly. His face crumpled, and he dropped to one knee right there on the porch steps, wrapping both arms around Max's neck, burying his face in that old golden fur. His shoulders heaved. He wept in the way that only comes when a man has been holding something too heavy for too long. Not quietly, not politely, but from somewhere so deep inside that it shook his whole frame. My eyes burned so fiercely I had to grip the door frame to hold steady. "He doesn't hold it against you," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Daniel pulled back just enough to look up at me. His face was wet, his eyes red and raw. "He should," he said, his voice barely holding together. "After what I did, what we did, he should." "Dogs don't work that way," I said. "Neither does God, I'm told." I pushed the screen door open wider. "Come inside, it's cold." He stood slowly, one hand still resting on Max's back like he needed the steadiness of it. He followed me inside without another word. I poured 2 cups of coffee, strong black the way Margaret always made it, and set them on Howard's kitchen table. Daniel wrapped both hands around his cup and stared into it like a man reading something written in the dark. "I didn't come to argue the judgment," he said quietly. "I know," I said, "and I didn't come to ask you to drop anything. Eleanor made it clear that ship has sailed." He exhaled slowly. "I came because..." His voice broke. He pressed his lips together hard, jaw working. "I came because I needed you to know that I know what I did. Not just legally. Not just the money. I know what I did to you as a person. As my father." I felt something shift in my chest, some long-held tightness beginning very slowly to loosen. "Vanessa made it easy," he continued, and his voice took on a sharper edge now, the edge of a man honest enough to stop making excuses even while he's explaining them. "She made it easy to tell myself you'd understand, that you'd want this for us, that it wasn't really alone, it was family, and family doesn't always need receipts." He shook his head, his expression tightening with disgust at himself. I understood. "I knew better, Dad. I knew better the night you signed that note. I knew what that land meant to you. I knew it was the last piece of ground Mama ever walked on, and I took it anyway." The mention of Margaret hit me like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. My throat ached. I took a slow breath through my nose and set my coffee cup down carefully. "You want to know what hurt me most?" I said. "It wasn't the money. I've worked without money before a Miller man knows how to do that. It wasn't even the house or the land. It was the night you handed me that suitcase." I looked at him directly, and I needed him to hear every word. "You handed me that suitcase and told me to take my dog and get out. And you said it like I was a stranger. Like 72 years of living, 40 years of sacrifice, a lifetime of loving you, like none of it had ever happened." Daniel's face went to pieces. He pressed one hand over his mouth. His whole body shook. The tears came without ceremony, without restraint, and he didn't try to stop them. He sat there at that kitchen table and let everything he'd been carrying for months pour out of him, and Max, who had settled at his feet, the moment we sat down, put his chin on Daniel's shoe and held very still. I let him cry. I didn't rush him. I didn't tell him it was fine. When he finally lifted his head, wiping his face with the back of his hand, I leaned forward and said steadily and clearly, "I forgive you, Daniel. I want you to know that. I forgive you because you are my son, and because carrying hatred is a weight I'm too old and too tired to carry." I paused, holding his gaze. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. It isn't the same as pretending it didn't happen. The judgment stands. The debt is real. And if you want a relationship with me, a real one, we build it from scratch. From truth. No shortcuts. No pretending. He nodded, his chin trembling. "I know," he whispered. "I know, Dad. I don't know if you'll ever be able to trust me again." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. My old carpenter's hand, rough and scarred and worn, and I said, "That part's up to you to earn, not me to give." He stayed for an hour. We didn't solve everything. We didn't fix everything. But when he walked out to his car in the late afternoon light and turned back once at the end of the driveway, I raised my hand. He raised his. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning. January came in quiet that year, not the crushing quiet of that October night, with a suitcase and a dog, and 11% left on my phone, but the other kind. The kind that smells like cold pine and wood smoke. The kind that only finds a man after the storm has finally passed. Howard's workshop had become mine in every practical sense. He gave me the corner by the big south-facing window, the best morning light in the building, and told me to use it as long as I needed. I was working on a rocking chair. White oak hand joinery, no nails the way my grandfather taught me, before I was tall enough to see over a workbench. The chair wasn't for anyone in particular, which is, I've learned, the freest way a craftsman can ever work. Max slept in a patch of winter sunlight on the floor, his old golden coat rising and falling like something peaceful and permanent. Ruth came by Wednesday morning with a tin of pecan shortbread and the expression of a woman who has news and intends to deliver it. "Eleanor called me," she said, dropping into the spare chair by my bench. "Daniel made his first payment toward the judgment, on time, full installment." I kept my plane moving slowly along the grain. "Good," I said. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "That's all you've got?" I looked up and felt the corner of my mouth pull into something that wasn't quite a smile but was close enough. "Ruth, a man can only carry so many dramatic emotions before his heart files for retirement." She laughed full and real, and Max's tail thumped twice against the floor without him opening his eyes. Pastor Jim came by that afternoon. Thinner than I remembered, moving carefully, the way a man does when he's learned to listen to his body. He stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the tools on the wall, the wood shavings on the floor, the half-finished chair catching the pale winter light. "You look like yourself again," he said simply. We drank coffee. He asked about Daniel. I told him about the visit before Christmas, the porch steps, Max pressing into Daniel's knee, the kitchen table, the tears neither of us tried to stop. "Like setting down something heavy," I said. "My arms can rest now." Pastor Jim turned his mug slowly. "The hardest thing about loving someone is letting them face what they've earned. You did that, George. Most men can't." My eyes burned. I stared at the workbench grain until the feeling passed. After he left, I went back to the chair. Max padded over and pressed his warm side against my leg, trusting completely without reservation. The way he has every single day for 10 years. I thought about Margaret, about the land, about a boy running barefoot across a Kentucky yard calling my name before supper. Love doesn't disappear when it gets bruised. It just goes underground, like roots in a hard winter, waiting for the ground to soften. Outside Howard's window, the January sky was clear and cold and wide open. The kind that makes no promises, but holds the whole world under it anyway. That I thought was more than enough. If I've learned anything from all of this, from the land sale, the suitcase, the rain, the courtroom, and the rocking chair, it's that love without boundaries isn't love. It's a habit of disappearing yourself until there's nothing left to give. I used to believe that a good father gives everything and asks for nothing. I was wrong about that. A good father gives honestly, asks clearly, and trusts that the people he loves are strong enough to handle the truth. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have said, "This is a loan, and I expect it to be honored not because I needed the money back, but because respect is built in the small, honest moments, long before the big ones break you." Don't do what I did. Don't let love make you invisible. Don't hand over the last piece of ground your wife ever walked on and call it a gift when your heart knows it isn't. The Bible says the truth will set you free, and I'll tell you, standing in that courthouse with Eleanor beside me and Max waiting at home, I finally understood what that freedom actually feels like. These grandpa stories aren't just mine. Every family has a version of this, a parent who gave too much without asking a child, who took without realizing, a silence that grew until it became a wall. That's why family story matters. Not to shame anyone, to remind us all that the people who love us most are not infinite. They have limits. They have hearts that break. If this grandpa story stayed with you, if this family story reminded you of someone you love, share it. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. And if you believe these grandpa stories deserve to reach someone who needs them, subscribe and bring them along for the next one. This has been a family story told from the porch of an old man who is still learning. Thank you truly for staying until the very end. One last thing, the stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely to carry real human lessons. If that's not the kind of content you're looking for right now, no hard feelings at all. Step away and find what serves you best. But if you're staying, I'm glad you're here.